can sit down.
Have a seat. So I'm pleased to introduce Sara Signorelli, who is a full-time teacher with New York City Department of Education, and she teaches students with disabilities participating in photography, work with a photography work-study program. She is working to create interdisciplinary lessons that teach core subjects through photography, lessons and emphasis using photography as a tool for communication. This is particularly powerful because of Ms. Signorelli's students are nonverbal with severe autism. She has nearly 20 years experience as teaching arts administrator, and photography. Currently, she also offers photography courses at Wagner College in Staten Island, Center for Lifelong Learning, where she received a master's degree in education. She previously taught photography at several nonprofit organizations, Pratt Institute, as well as public and private schools throughout Staten Island. Ms. Signorelli was a co-owner of a photography studio, Fine Art Photos, Inc., for several years. She continues commercial photography as a freelance event and wedding photographer. She's a judge and guest speaker for camera clubs throughout the tri-state area. Ms. Signorelli was awarded numerous grants supporting both fine art photography exhibitions and her artist in residency effort. She won fine art awards dating back to 1997. Her solo exhibitions have shown at Pratt Institute, Manhattan Theater Source, Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art, the St. George Theater, and Silver Eye Center for Photography in Pittsburgh. She has contributed to group exhibitions that have traveled throughout the eastern United States. So that's a lot. And we look forward to your presentation this evening.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for having me. It's really an honor to be speaking to you and sharing my passion for photography. As a teacher, I always have to have an objective when I do a lesson. So my biggest goal for tonight is if you can think about broader ideas of how to apply what I'm saying and my journey through creating this series of artwork into the subject matter that you find important as well. Because it's not only that I'm going to show abandoned interior photographs, but I'm going to kind of give you an idea of the path that led me here, and some of the professors' guidance through that in the early start too. But can we shut the lights?
Yeah, lights.
This is a series that I exhibited early 2000s. It was called Vacancy, and it was about 20 or so abandoned interior spaces. When I was in college, I received my bachelor's degree in art with a concentration in photography from the College of Staten Island, CUNY. And one of the things that stuck with me that the professors encouraged me was really to choose a theme to work within once you enter your professional career as an artist. So I kind of had, a few things I wanted to do or I was drawn to. And one being abandoned buildings. The other was portraiture. However, at the time, this is before digital photography was invented, I felt a little bit insecure about working with individuals without having that level of skill and experience. And shooting film where, I'd have another person sort of asking, how the photos come out, can I see them, can I have, whatever it was. So I decided, okay, let me go with abandoned buildings because of their accessibility also. I could return to the space time and time again until I was happy with the images, getting them just the way that I wanted them. Now, in doing this theme, I learned a lot of lessons. You know, one being that you're, in a way, photographing the same subject repeatedly, it kind of becomes a little bit boring. And in order to challenge myself, I began to learn a lot of the technical aspects of photography, or master them really through this. And one thing I started to play with was extended exposures. So this shutter speed was open for 45 minutes, this one in particular.
Wow.
And I learned about reciprocity effect through that. And in color film, you get severe color shifts. So this was in a basement of a house, and it was not in the beginning of the series. Actually, after I started to exhibit the work, that's when other people started approaching me and saying, oh, I have this abandoned house I know of, can I take you there? And this was in the basement. There was, when I saw it, it was just this way, except there was like a bag of concrete on the seat. So I didn't move it. I do kind of change the environment slightly to create the composition of my desire, but I was not really aware of these severe kind of monochromatic color shifts that would happen from the extended exposures. So this is another version of the print, and the whole series I printed 16 by 20 on Fuji Flex paper, which is the high gloss paper, and I had framed them in old window frames. You can show the next one. So this is a smaller version. Sorry, it's not so clear, but you can start to see. I have other examples too that I use old window frames in the mounting, and this one as well. And here's the detail of that. Now there was like 4 signature images that I personally fell in love with, and this was one of them as well, because I thought that it said in one image with this, you know, graffiti. The backstory to this is that the house is being demolished, and the family who have lived there for many years have wrote messages to their, loving messages to their home. So this is "Rest in Peace, Good Old House," signed Grant. This again is another example of the mounting. You can show the detail of the image. I call this the bed, and this is something that was one of the signature images, like I said, but also, you can go to the next one. Also, it sold for about $750 in a gallery, Soho Photo in
Sorry.
So, this was shot with a fisheye lens that I rented. I didn't own this lens, and this was, I believe, a 36-minute exposure. And the way that I came about starting to play with these long exposures was I knew in this image, this was like one of the first images that brought me to this technique, because I wanted to show the greatest depth of field and the most detail in all of the layers and the textures and the ground and the walls, and the paint chipping away. Again, I didn't move it. You can kind of see like track marks to create the composition I wanted. It was very slight movement. And all of, when you shoot on aperture that has a, you know, like a 22 or 16, any points of light become like a burst of a starburst. So you start to see that happening here. And there's another image later on that you'll see. But this image in particular was taken in an abandoned hospital, Seaview Hospital on Staten Island, that once served as a tuberculosis clinic. Now, previously, before working for the Board of Ed, I had spent 8 years serving in various capacities at the Alice Austin House Museum. If any of you know about this woman, she was born in 1866, she died in 1952, and she created 8,000 images in her lifetime. But she died penniless, and Alice spent time in the last years of her life in this hospital. So now I started to bring another level of interest for me, the local history of my island, and I think that really broadened my audience, because now, you know, I could share my images with local historians that could write about it, people who were interested. So, and I had that personal connection as well for Alice Austin. But most importantly, what I came to realize very early on was, because when you create an exhibit, galleries want an artist statement. So I began to write about my work. And I brought here today just a little, it's actually a handmade book. It's only a limited edition of one. And at the end of my presentation, I do have a video that I read it aloud, but it is 20 minutes long, so I'm not sure if we're going to get to that. But if any of you are interested, you can follow me on Instagram, Sara Sign Photo, SaraSignPhoto, and you can contact me. I'd be happy to give you my email as well, and I can share the video with you. But I will read some excerpts from it as I'm showing some of the work. But this book is a lot of random writings that I had done. I've always written since I was a teenager, and now that I'm just about 40 years old, I'm working, my current personal work is going to read more like a memoir style, so it's a lot of stories from my life accompanied by photographs. So the thing that this brought me to realize is that I could draw parallels, symbolic parallels of my own self in this subject matter. And so I started to ask myself questions, and that's things that I really want to encourage you as artists to do as well. You know, the structures are left forgotten or unwanted, or you know, they have a deep history as well. So one of the things, the most adverse, I guess, traumatic events of my life as a childhood was my father was an alcoholic, and he kind of left me feeling that same way. So I explored those ideas and, you know, psychological trauma, but also coming of age issues. I was at that time when I was becoming 20, you know, into an adult. I had moved out of my house, and my mother is a nurse. So the image of the hospital and the old hospital bed with the cranks, I was able to, again, you know, create these, you know, explorations of self through it. This is another, I just wanted to show the detail of the framing, but you can go to the next image for the detail. This I used a wooden door to a hutch, or like a china closet. I used a lot of, like I said, found objects that people were throwing away. And at that time, I don't really see it as much, but Staten Island was going through a phase of development. And a lot of people were removing all of these old window frames and replacing it, you know, with these modernized things. So I was able to gather all of these supplies. But the framing process took me like 8 hours, because everything was irregular and it was very difficult to frame. So when I say I sold some work for $750, it really didn't pay, because there was 20 other pieces that didn't sell that I gave away. And each piece took 8 hours, so right there, it's, you know, just to frame, let alone shoot the film and all that. But this is another historic site, and I lived very close by it. It was one of the first locations that I captured, and I did have to return to it several times. I call this the Caves. The title is the Caves, but it was at one time Demian's Hearthbrow, actually the location of my grandparents' wedding reception. But when I was in my late teens or so, it was a nightclub. And then before that, I mean, again, these structures go back to the 1800s. It had stored like beer and hops. So there's no natural light. It's totally enclosed. And that was my biggest challenge in figuring out how to capture the space. So I went in at first with flashlights. You know, at the time I already was experimenting with light painting and teaching light painting and teaching darkroom. But I was not able to control it in the way that I wanted to, and the images weren't. And I also explored black and white, But I came about this. This is again, about a 40-minute exposure, and I placed 400 tea lights. I just bought a bag from IKEA, really, and I had a friend who was a photo assistant helping me. And the space was very cold. So to have the tea lights and placing them, on the heat on my finger, it really brought me into this subconscious state. It was like living in a dream, almost like working in the darkroom has that same feeling, like you're in some kind of a spaceship or a think tank, So it had this meditative, therapeutic process. So now I'm changing this idea of the unwanted spaces to something beautiful, right? So that is almost the same idea of what I wanted to go through for myself, like psychologically, to come of age, to be an adult and an established artist. So just another detail too. And you can go to the next one. This is actually in the same space as that chair picture and the rest in peace good old house picture. It's in the kitchen, but again, I was very drawn to it because of the ideas of home life and domestic life, and myself becoming a woman and eventually maybe becoming a wife, and all of these ideas I was able to write about and think about aside from the technical aspects. So that's one of the biggest things that I want to try to leave with you tonight as photographers is I hope that you're writing about your photography. And some people ask me, well, what if I just like to write what if I just like to take pictures of nature and but there's a lot of ideas that you can explore, and as an artist you have to really be ready to, and it's part of the process that I think is a great thing, to argue with people and to come to bring minds together and really to form. I would love to see photography take on a new movement, artistically. You have throughout the history of art, Cubism and Impressionism. I would love that photography really come to a new movement and a higher level of consciousness.
So
Yeah.
what if you're not a writer? What if you're not a creative writer?
Yeah, I was not either. Like I said, I started when I was 16. Some of this stuff I could read to you. But then, I think it's important just to write it down and just to write down whatever ideas you can. And then as you're working through your theme and your process, then you can draw connections to your writings. This one here, I had reworked many times. It's called Outgrown. Each word is to every decaying breath in that both transmit change. Rejection of all that's been taught, drawn as the tides at foot at shoreline. I find the sands not so sandy, but woody. Reminds me of the hard wooden floors I grew up in. The water slowly rises. Strange, I always felt so safe in that couch. I bent over and take a fearful bite into the cushion, but am left with a mouth full of water. Frantic, aggravated, I'm drowning. The water's swollen shut, all the doors and windows, questioning my perception of reality and what I know myself capable, leaves the water to grow higher. It soaks through my clothes, lucid and tragic, held beautiful touches, every millimeter of skin trapped within its killer, the dying seconds, provocation of thought and pizza philosophies. But by some stroke of dumb luck or coincidence, the weight of this cold, silent killer forces through the confines of the house. Shock and exhaustion subside, for the house may have been the murderer, the water the martyred hero. I haven't fallen, the ground's been cocked. Within the core of I've finally begun to understand experience, but it's merely the beginning. 2001. So I'm like 19, 20 years old, at the time. Other things that I have in here is just house rules. Put away what you use. Keep surfaces clear and clean. So this was a note that my roommate put up in the apartment because, you know, as an artist, I'm constantly creating and I'm, you know, constantly collecting, and so I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say I'm a slob. I don't like dirt and disgust, but I have a lot of stuff. So yeah, you know, like just little sentences here and there that connect to the work I was able to over time. And someone recently contacted me, very interested in my work, and I looked through some of the early journals, I'll call them, and I write maybe once a year at some point, or, you know, every few months. So don't beat yourself up over, you know, how often do I write? I'm not writing that great. And, you know, that one prose, I'll call it, Outgrown, is something that I kind of worked through for several years. But finding yourself, like, I think his name is Robert Adams. I just discovered his work. He photographed like life on the street in Chicago and a lot of landscapes, but he's written a lot of great books about photography. And I look at his work and I can see him in the street photographs that he takes, or the landscapes. Somehow I can tell what type of a person. There's an expression of himself in that work. And I think that's really what separates the amateur photographers from, you know, the great artists. This was on an abandoned train. Now, my father worked in the train for 30 years, and you know, he's like, I got daddy issues. He's got a very strong impact on my development, obviously. I guess all our parents are. But his story in particular, he spent 30 years working for the Staten Island Rapid Transit in various capacities, you know, first collecting, I guess you call it a conductor, but he called the conductor driving the train too. So he drove the train, and my house was next door to the train tracks. So I have this love affair with the train. I mean, I love machines too. I love working even with the film cameras. You know, students would give me their broken film cameras and I would play around with it, or the enlarger. So I'm very interested in machines, I think because of him. And he would drive ride the train up alongside my house. And this was back in the day, you could never get away with any of this anymore. But he would stop the train full of passengers and come into the house and take me as a 7-year-old girl, and I would climb up the ladder to the car where he would drive the train, and he would close off the train car to passengers, and I would have the train to myself to run free. And I remember this moment of laying on my back across the bench of the train with my head bobbing off the edge, you know, looking at the greenery passing through. And I was able to really connect with a lot of, you know, visual beauty that I think made me become the photographer that I am today. So this is a detail on an abandoned train. Now this train car is an earlier model than what he drove, but you know, they have these, like, I don't know, maybe you guys who are like into trains know this better, but there's like a basket weave seat, I guess.
Cane.
Say it again? Rattan, thank you, because I will be trying to do a post about this, because I have a lot of images from this train car. So on Facebook, I've been collaborating with this local historian, Pat Solomon, who's written books about Staten Island history. So I was trying to explain this photograph to her, and she didn't know either, so I'll tell her it's the rattan. And you know, again, the layers and the texture of the paint, and of course that those of you who know the color wheel, the contrasting colors of red and green. And someone recently said to me, we were talking about photography, and he said that he loves black and white photography, and I do as well. But I feel like this series had the same kind of a quality as black and white does in many ways, because it has this monochromatic color. I think the next one is probably just the frame, so you can go through that. And this one again is just not one of my favorite images, but just messages to the house from the different family members. can kind of go through these quickly. I have some more details at the end that I'd like to show you. Now I break into a little bit of digital photography, and this is really like the tail end of this exhibition. But I have to say, for myself, and I hope for all of you, like one question a lot of people ask me is, when you're working within a series, do you just photograph that? And my answer is no. But I'm always thinking about that series, and I'm always kind of planning it out, talking to people about it, writing about it. And so that kind of is the predominant thing in my mind, in my life. But abandoned buildings, my point is something that I still photograph till today. And the most pictures I take, although I do have a Canon digital SLR, it's set up, say hi everybody. I wanted to try to take a video, so it's set up on the tripod in the back, taking a video. And then I have a little point and shoot Canon that mostly my 6-year-old daughter uses. But I have an iPhone 8 Plus, and I do the most work with that. I'm able to sneak a lot of pictures that I would not normally be able to with that, and get a real, true life experience. So for that memoir that I was talking about, that works really well for me. But this is the beginning of digital photography, and I went into a building at Snug Harbor Cultural Center, where I did work for a number of years, teaching darkroom and photography, working in the gallery. But, so I had some access to these buildings, but I didn't get permission for any of this. All of these buildings have been since renovated at Snug Harbor. So this was kind of before the transition to it. And I did go in with one other person here who was kind of doing some graffiti, a graffiti artist. And there are ghost-like images of him in some of the images. So let's see if there's any other pictures. You can go to the next one. This one,